You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast.
For a while, it was the only dedicated African economic history research seminar in the world. We had people coming from all over the continent, as well as from Europe and the US. And so it's just a pattern over and over again of whatever happens to be the faddish way of thinking about the economy in Britain, in the US, in France, in a particular decade, ends up being seen as like, of course, that's the solution to whatever they perceive the problem to be in Africa. What do these observations about how Africa's economies really work reflect back onto these Western economies?
Stay tuned as we bring you inspiring people who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast with your host, Tessa Adamu.
Welcome to the Unlocking Africa podcast, where we find inspirational people who are doing inspirational things to unlock Africa's economic potential. Today we have Bronwen Everill, a fellow of Gonville Caius College and was the director of Cambridge University's Centre for African Studies, recently joined the faculty of the Princeton Writing Program, and a visiting fellow at the Laboratory for the Economics of Africa's Past in the Department of Economics at Stellenbosh University. Welcome to the podcast, Bronwen. How are you?
Very good. Thank you so much for having me.
How was that introduction?
Yeah, that's fine.
Brilliant. No, thank you for joining us on the podcast. I know it's something that we've been discussing for quite a while to get you on to talk about this fantastic book that you have published, which is Africonomics, a history of Western ignorance. I guess the book also highlights the West's lack of understanding of African economics, which is a very interesting position and I guess topic to discuss. But before we get into the conversation, I was hoping you could give us an introduction just to tell us a bit more about yourself.
Yeah, sure. So I am from the US originally, and I had been teaching in the UK for the past 15 years. So I've only just moved back to join the Princeton Writing faculty. As you said, was directing the Center of African Studies at Cambridge for a while. And at Cambridge, I co-ran the African Economic History seminar, the research seminar, where we would bring in people working on these topics from around the world. And I co-ran that with Gareth Austin. And for a while, it was the only dedicated African economic history research seminar in the world. And we had people coming from all over the continent, as well as from Europe and the US, people working on these topics. And so the book is based on my own research, but it is also an attempt to sort of feature some of the research that people brought to the seminar. So to sort of think about how all of that research that we saw coming through our research seminar over those 8 or so years, how that can sort of help illuminate these bigger questions in imperial history and economic history, in these global questions about how economic development has happened over the past 200 years, but from a very local perspective, because we had all these great contributors from everywhere. And so the book really features a lot of the work that people are doing in those sort of more grounded local stories. So it is my research, but it's also an attempt to feature all of these other researchers from the continent and beyond.
As you mentioned, you're originally from the US, lived in the UK. So I was wondering, how did this interest in African economics begin?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's like a couple of converging paths, right? I think in one of the chapters of the book, later chapters, I sort of get into a little bit of like my own history with the sort of humanitarian ideas that were really prevalent in the 90s in the US and in the UK, these sort of ideas that, you know, Africa was this benighted continent that needed all kinds of forms of rescue. So, I worked in a fair trade shop, and I, had one of these armbands in the sort of Save Darfur era, right? So I think that that was always in the back of my mind. And as I became a historian of African economic history, I sort of realized how much I was part of the problem, in that era. And so from the research side of it, my PhD was on Sierra Leone and Liberia in the 19th century. So how they were established as anti-slavery colonies, what it means to be an anti-slavery colony, right? Like anti-slavery, good, colony, bad, right? So what is the what are the internal contradictions that happen when Britain and the US start thinking about Africa as a place to not only have this sort of slave trading relationship, right, which they had in the 17th, 18th century, but in the 19th century, trying to sort of transform that relationship into something new while not giving up the kind of exploitative power that they have in that relationship. So that's the kind of driving research question. Like, what kind of power does a humanitarian perspective give the person who holds the humanitarian perspective? What is the sort of power that pity gives the pitier, right? And that has been present through a lot of my research questions. And then I was really wanting to focus in on the economic side of that for this book.
So I guess a lot of these misconceptions or perceptions, one drives the other. But I was hoping you could probably elaborate on, I guess, from your perspective, how do some of these historical misconceptions about African wealth influence the Western interventions that we do see?
What the book sort of sets out to do is that each chapter looks at a particular person arriving on the continent and thinking that they perceive a problem that they can fix with their, advanced Western knowledge or whatever. And so it starts in the late 18th century, and then each chapter sort of moves us a little bit forwards, and it ends pretty contemporarily. So the sort of pattern that I found in teaching this subject and in doing the research on it was that basically somebody would come and put in some new plan, some new intervention to fix what they thought the problems were. And then, a couple of decades later, a new person would arrive and see the sort of outcome of that original intervention and say, oh, there's this problem with Africa's economies, and I'm going to implement this thing, right? So, it's kind of like they don't see that there are going to be any kind of externalities to the kinds of interventions that they make, right? They think that there's going to be one quick fix to any of these problems, and that they are going to be the one to implement it. And then, of course, there are consequences to that. And, these interventions end up reshaping things. And then the next generation comes, and then they are already in a position of thinking that, Africa's economies are problematic, so we need to come and intervene. And so then they either undo all the things that the previous generation did, or they bring in new plans that then, mess it up again. And so it's just a pattern over and over again of whatever happens to be the sort of trendy, faddish way of thinking about the economy in Britain, in the US, in France, wherever, in a particular decade, ends up being seen as of course, that's the solution to, whatever they perceive the problem to be in Africa. So this happens over and over again. So the book sort of comes back to several themes. One is this idea of wealth in people versus wealth in land, right? So in Europe, land is very scarce and expensive, and there are a lot of people, so labor is fairly cheap in the 19th century. In Africa, that sort of calculus is completely switched, right? There is actually quite an abundant amount of land, and labor is scarce. And so land theoretically ought to be the thing that's cheap, and labor is the thing that's expensive. But because in Europe, it's the other way around, a lot of the solutions that they come up with for what they perceive to be Africa's problems, so things like a lot of land that isn't being used for farming, for instance, they see that and they're like, oh, well, they just don't know how to farm, or, oh, they're just not very efficient at farming. When in fact, it's just that they don't need to, because actually there's abundant land. Lots of it can lay fallow. And then they look at how much laborers are asking to work, how much they're asking in wages. And they're like, oh, they're so lazy because they don't want to work for these cheap wages that we want to give them. They have to be taught how to be proper laborers. Well, of course, they don't want to work for those cheap wages. They know that they're in high demand, right? That's not the case like it is in England, where actually there's just an abundance of laborers. And if you want any work at all, you're going to have to accept a cheap wage, right? So instead of seeing the economy as an economy, they arrive with this idea that, the economy ought to be the same as it is in Europe. And therefore, the fact that it isn't is some kind of moral failure of the Africans that they're encountering. And that actually what they need is education in the right way to be economic people, rather than that, actually the economy in Europe is one thing, the economy in Africa is another thing, right? And it's not that one of them has the right universal laws and the other one doesn't. It's that the laws of the economy in Europe are just different. The laws of the economy in Africa are just different. And neither of them is actually the universal.
Fantastic. So, I'd like to take it back from the beginning. As you mentioned, the book starts in the 18th century, touching on the slave trade. So if we start from here, looking at the book, how do you tackle this very, sensitive topic in terms of how the abolition of the slave trade shaped subsequent economic interventions in Africa?
Yeah, so I think I start from the premise that the slave trade was important for economic development, right? So taking Eric Williams at face value and saying, yes, the slave trade contributed to economic growth in Europe. It contributed to economic growth in the Americas. It contributed, in a certain sense, to a kind of economic growth in West Africa, where the slave trade was coming from, right? So in all of those places, certain kinds of governments really benefited from the slave trade. Certain influential merchants really benefited from the slave trade. In all of those places, slavery was terrible for the people who were enslaved. And in all of those places, there were lots of other people who were also negatively economically impacted by the slave trade. But for the states that were involved and for the individual companies or individuals who were invested in it, it was enriching in lots of ways, right? So taking the sort of starting point of, by the end of the 18th century, the slave trade was a functioning economic system in the same way that, I guess you could say, the illegal drugs trade is a functioning economic system, right? There are people who benefit from it a lot, yes. Right? And it has rules, and it probably functions pretty efficiently at this point because it's been going on for a long time, right? So this is a system that exists and it works for some people. When it's abolished, the people who are involved with slavery in places like Britain, in France, they are compensated by the governments. And by the governments, I mean by the taxpayers of those countries, right? So the abolition of the slave trade and of slavery is sort of mitigated for those economies, right, internally. When the abolitionists arrive in Africa, there is a little bit of an attempt to do some mitigation, right? So they try to introduce something called legitimate commerce, which is basically looking for any other product that they can find that could be in the same sort of amount of demand as enslaved people were, and therefore not disrupt the economies too much. Inevitably, trying to switch away, making one kind of trade illegal and switching away to another takes time. And not every place that had been good at exporting enslaved people turns out to be good at exporting other kinds of commodities. So there are economic impacts, right? So there's that side of it, but there's also the side that as slavery is abolished gradually on the continent over the 19th century, there is not compensation, right, for that. And so ultimately, across the 19th century, the governments in Europe who claim, that they're like intervening in Africa's economies because the slave trade has made them backwards, don't apply the same laws of that intervention on the continent that they do at home, right? They give money to they give money to the people affected at home. They do not give money to the people affected in Africa. And partially that is because it all sort of builds into a narrative of seeing Africa as a place where there are victims and there are perpetrators. And the role of Europeans is to protect African victims from African perpetrators. And that becomes an important story that Europeans tell themselves about what they're doing when they're doing imperialism on the continent.
Interesting. So if we move from the slave trade, obviously we've touched on the abolition and then I guess follows the whole colonial era. From the book, how are the legacies of the colonial economic interventions still visible in African economies today?
Ooh. Yeah, I mean, I think there are a number of different threads that pull through there. I think one of the things that's hard to do in thinking about colonialism and colonialism's legacies is colonialism is a system of governance that arrives with capitalism, that arrives with urbanization, that arrives with industrialization, that arrives with an attempt to sort of globalize and integrate commodity markets. And so picking apart, which things are a result of global capitalism and which things are a result of colonialism is really hard. Yeah. I think it's a little bit easier, I guess, to say that that the legacies of that period can be seen, but it's hard to necessarily point to specific things that are colonial versus capitalist. But I would say the overwhelming legacy in the long term is the big shift away from the land abundance, labor scarcity model, right? Yeah. So if that's the predominant way to think about the sort of different kinds of approaches that existed in the pre-colonial era, by the end of the colonial era, those have shifted quite significantly. And so you do start to get labor abundance, in the late 20th century as a result of that. So that's one real big shift, I would say.
Yeah. I guess if we move from that to obviously the current times and look at, as you said, it's hard to pinpoint specifically what stemmed from colonialism, but we still see certain issues or factors play within the economies. But what would you say are some of the most persistent myths which are probably tied to those legacies?
Yeah, I think that idea that there are two kinds of Africans. There are the victims and the perpetrators is a really persistent one, right? So that a lot of the time, I think, the kinds of success in business or success in I guess capitalism or whatever, it tends to be read with that sort of lens. So for instance, if you get somebody like, a Dan Goatee, for instance, who's, I'm sure totally not unproblematic, but is wildly successful, right, as a business person. The kind of read that you get on that is with this eye to, we know that there are, Africans on the continent who exploit other Africans. And so should we celebrate his success or should we be very skeptical of his success? And I'm all for being skeptical of business people's success. That's totally fine. But I think that it gets read in a way that a sort of similar kind of entrepreneurial success in some place like the US or in Britain would not get read, right? Or similarly, if you think about the ways that government corruption is reported when it's reported about Africa. I mean, again, I'm sure that there is government corruption happening 100%. I'm not doubting that. But I also know that there's government corruption in a lot of Western countries, right? And I think that the ways that it gets reported in the Western media when talking about Africa is as though it's expected, like, oh, of course, that's the way it is there, right? But also as though it is Westerners, therefore, responsibility to do something about it on behalf of everybody else, which is definitely, not the approach that, for instance, the U.S. takes to the U.K., right? And so a big part of the story that I'm trying to tell in the book is the story of that power, the power to intervene economically in ways that, the West doesn't do to itself, right? If we suspect that there's economic corruption in, I don't know, Germany, we're not really going to do anything about it. We might talk to them, but we're not going to stop trading with them. Whereas that is the case when the Western media talks about, for instance, Zimbabwe or something. So.
Totally, I understand. So I guess going back to the point you made about success, I think you made a point in terms of how have Western metrics such as GDP skewed perceptions of African success or failure?
Yeah, so this comes up in one of my chapters when I talk about Samir Amin, who is an Egyptian economist who starts to notice pretty quickly after independence in the late 60s and through the 70s that these metrics that are crucial for newly independent countries to get the loans that they need or the funding that they need to do the infrastructure projects that will help them to realize their development goals, that those metrics are really not fit for purpose. And so there's a really wonderful book by somebody who has worked on this topic exclusively, Morton Jervin, which is called Poor Numbers. And also Polly Hill is another economic anthropologist who's worked on this topic. But, the chapter looks at all three of these people and thinks about, the fact that, as Samir Amin points out, a lot of the kinds of economic activity that are happening in post-colonial Africa are, internal, right? So, and there's what is, commonly referred to as subsistence agriculture, right? As part of, like a big part of the mix. And there isn't really a way of counting that kind of economic activity when you're thinking about GDP. And that the sort of statistics offices that are set up in these early post-colonial governments, and then that are trying to sort of stagger through the structural adjustment period in the 1980s and stuff, that they just really don't have the capacity to, collect the kind of data that goes into the production of GDP numbers in highly, in places that have, like, for instance, income tax, like the US or whatever, right? And so those kinds of metrics are, really patchy, but are somehow being pasted together in these sort of ramshackle ways to try to present this picture of economic performance in order to get these loans and to show that, the countries can pay them back. This isn't to say that those countries are, not capable of paying them back, especially in the 1960s. They have, a sort of economic boom because there's so much demand for the kinds of commodities that they're producing. But that, that ultimately the kinds of measures that are being imposed on them are just not they're not measures that are fit for purpose because they're not homegrown measures, right? So if a newly independent Ghana, for instance, wanted to get some loans, what I think an internal accounting system would probably look very different from what was being imposed from outside. And that's sort of what Samir Amin is trying to argue for. He's saying, we need actually to think about educating ourselves in sort of like local understandings of the economy to sort of reframe the way that we're projecting our economic successes to the world. But unfortunately, in the 70s and then into the 80s, the decline in the price of commodities means that the IMF does come in and sort of impose structural adjustment and, doubles down on that kind of counting.
Fantastic. So I guess if we consider GDP obviously as a Western metric, what are some of the examples of African economic thought that Western interventions have overlooked?
Yeah. I think one of the things that the book is trying to actually argue is that this is a sort of two-way problem, right? So there's the problem of Western imposition of what Westerners think are these universal models, and sort of just like trying to make Africa's economies fit their preconceptions. But there's also a sort of doubling back there, which is what do these observations about how Africa's economies really work reflect back onto these Western economies, right? So thinking about that sort of wealth and people idea, like, that there is this misread of what wealth and people are doing. So in that very first chapter, the protagonist is like observing that, people are wearing sort of weird combinations of secondhand European clothes. They live in thatched houses. She thinks that means they're poor, but she also observes that they have like the king has lots of wives, right? And so she's sort of misunderstanding that like actually what's going on there is that he has this wealth in people, and that he's just putting on the things that he knows Europeans read as wealth in terms of their clothes for a European audience. But the chapter then says, but like actually there's wealth in people in various situations in England in this period. If you think about Jane Austen, there's all kinds of considerations about like how people display their wealth through the number of servants they have, for instance. So it's the problems that I identified with GDP actually have manifested themselves in Western economies in the past 10 years, right? So for instance, a big problem in counting GDP in African countries for a long time was this problem of informal labor, right? People who are not working in the formal labor market, it's hard to count their economic contribution, right? And so there's a sort of economic idea emerging around, informal labor markets in Africa. But Western economists aren't really paying attention to that emerging discussion about informal labor markets and how to count them. And then you get the rise of the gig economy in the West, right? And rather than looking to Africa for an example of how we could think about counting informal labor when thinking about how the economy is functioning, they try to make it from, they try to like squeeze informal laborers into the existing model in the West, right? Let's just like try to like make this work here. Or let's try to come up with a wholly new way of thinking about the gig economy, right? And so it's partially that the Western ideas don't fit the African model, but it's also that like the West seems to refuse to look to Africa as a model for themselves, right? Yes. It's like, oh no, we couldn't possibly learn anything from there. Like it's so different there that it's got to be there. But also we can make them more like us, rather than being like, oh, actually, look, they have something that we actually now have, and maybe thinking about the way that they're doing it there is going to help us here. So the informal economy is one example of that. And the way that people are sort of thinking about wealth and people, the way that people are thinking about gifts, the way that people think about moral economy more generally, right? So like how to manage unequal economies, how to sort of regulate the accumulation of wealth by one or two individuals within a particular economy. And the West has one way of dealing with that, and I think regularly looks at these places in Africa. Looks at Uganda and is like, oh no, like some people are becoming wealthy. We have to intervene because otherwise they're going to take advantage of everybody else, and we have to be there to rescue African victims from African perpetrators. But in fact, Rhiannon Stevens, one of the people who I talk about in the book, has done a whole lot of research on this existing moral economy that has a system for making sure that nobody becomes outlandishly wealthy relative to everybody else, right? So maybe we could look to those kinds of systems and think like, are there other ways of regulating growing inequality in our own backyard?
I mean, within the book, you argue that applying the universal economic laws to Africa is fundamentally flawed, which I guess also links into that notion in terms of, as you call it, is it Western economic experiments, even when well-meaning, can cause harm. I was wondering if you can kind of go into a bit more detail regarding that.
Yeah, so I think there's like an example in one of the chapters about this anti-slavery guy called Thomas Fowle Buxton, who really wants desperately to end slavery in Africa and the slave trade from Africa in the like 1830s and 1840s. He writes a couple of books. He gets the British government to like give a bunch of money to send a mission up the Niger River to set up a model farm to help teach people around the Niger how to farm. Buxton has no experience in farming. He's a businessman in London. He works in a brewery industry. But he thinks farming is like good, wholesome activity, and that people who farm are like good, wholesome kinds of people. And that this would, break the, if people were self-sufficient farmers in Africa, then they wouldn't rely on the proceeds from the slave trade. And so they could get off of the slave trade reliance there. And the chapter outlines what happens in that mission. I don't want to give you a spoiler there, but I think what is really hilarious to me is that at exactly the same time, the leader of what is now referred to as the Sokoto Caliphate, but is basically the sort of largest state in this region, which is in northern Nigeria, but also spreads from Chad to sort of Burkina Faso kind of area. Big state of all these sort of emirates, and the leader of that has set up cotton planting in this region. So when the model farm people arrive there with their cotton plants that fail, they actually have to go to one of these emirates and ask for cotton plants, right? So they're going there to show people how to farm. And in the end, they have to go to the people to be like, actually, your cotton plants are thriving. Can you show us how to farm, right? So, on the one hand, comedy of errors in that they're like really well-intentioned. They really have good motives at heart. They want to end slavery. That's I think we can all get behind that as a motive, but they're so full of ignorance, that they just can't do it. And it would be sort of just a sort of sad comedy of errors for them. But there is that power dynamic ends up coming into play, right? So that desperation to abolish the slave trade, to that is their moral purpose in West Africa, just keeps building and building, and there are more and more interventions in this part of Nigeria until they destroy the Sokoto Caliphate, right? On the premise that actually there is slavery in the Sokoto Caliphate as well. I would like to point out at the same time that, there's slavery in the US and in Brazil, and, you don't see much of Britain intervening there. Some of Britain intervening, but not much. But that ends up destroying it. And then, Britain comes in and sets up its own government and all of this. So, it would be funny if they didn't have the power to actually, end up destroying things, I think.
So do you see parallels between these type of historical Western interventions and some of the current interventions, whether it's international aid practices or interventions from your multilaterals? Do you see the same similar patterns or parallels?
Yeah, I think there are plenty. I think the issue with any kind of economic intervention, regardless of where it is that there are always going to be winners and losers to any kind of economic change, right? People will be able to take advantage of the economic change and other people will not, right? And I think the idea that there's an economic intervention which is going to be good for everybody, that simply doesn't exist. You only have to look at US looming tariff policies to understand that those are going to be good for some people and bad for other people, right? And most people are already, set up in whatever kind of business they're going to be set up in. So if it's bad for them, that's not great. So I think, I was recently working on a research project in Zimbabwe, and people kept referring to the fact it was not related to this particular intervention, but people kept referring to the fact that Tony Blair initiated the economic sanctions against Mugabe's regime, totally meaning well, right? I mean, he was thinking, okay, I can use the economy to sort of force this guy to behave in a way that it aligns with what we think of as international norms. But the people who were most affected by that were not Mugabe, right? Were, just average middle-class Zimbabweans. And it had this, devastating impact on the Zimbabwe economy. Did it have some kind of impact on, correcting the course of the country? I guess ultimately, maybe it did. But with this long-lasting effect on the middle class in that country. So I think that's a sort of good contemporary example of, using these economic tools to try to correct something that the West thinks needs correcting, but not sort of anticipating who it's going to impact the most.
Interesting. So I guess if we go back to the book and its lessons, what lessons do you think policymakers can learn from Africonomics when approaching interventions or whether it's development work on the continent?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the sort of simplest takeaway would be, if you think that you're the first person to come up with this idea, you're probably not. Yeah. So, if you think agriculture is the key, hopefully you will have read the Thomas Val Buxton chapter. Yeah, I think it's just that these same interventions keep coming over and over again, the same ideas that oh, actually, trade is the answer. Oh, actually, competitive advantage is the answer. Oh, actually, agriculture is the answer. Oh, actually, some kind of educational policy is the answer, right? And that every time there's this sort of hope that there will be some kind of quick fix. So I don't really have forward-looking. I'm a historian. I only look back, right? I don't really have forward-looking advice, but I hope that people reading this will at least get a sense that, if they think that they have a quick fix, or if they think that they've thought of something that nobody has thought of before, that actually probably in the past 200 years, somebody has thought about this. And I guess what I really hope is that it has some kind of impact on the way that people think about their own power to do it, right? So if you feel like you have the power to make this kind of intervention, is that a problem? Should that power really be in the hands of people in these African countries? I think I make a sort of plea for democracy at the end, which, is basically to say, I think that we don't give enough credit to people on the continent to hold their own governments accountable. I don't think we give enough credit to people on the continent to make their own economic choices. I don't think we give enough credit to people on the continent to sort of know more about how to live their lives than we do. And so hopefully that really is something that people pause, at least if they're thinking about policy making.
Thank you for sharing that. So I guess if we look closer to yourself, as a historian doing the great work that you're doing, how do you manage to balance, one, your academic research with engaging broader audiences through books like Africonomics?
Yeah. So, I think this is like my first attempt to engage broader audiences. I think that there's a lot of this research out there, right? Like I said before, I'm not the first person to be doing any of this research myself. But my previous research was on these earlier 19th century abolitionist movements and their economic impact on Africa. And then, the book brings together that and all of these other perspectives. And I've spent a lot of time in rooms talking with other academics and other researchers working in these fields. And I think we all have a sense of frustration that these stories are not better known. And so the idea with Africonomics was actually to bring all of this deep research that everybody is doing together in a way that would introduce it to a broader audience. And, hopefully they'll go into the bibliography and read some of these papers and engage with the sort of deeper research that people are doing out there. I think as individual researchers, we are only able to go deep in our little areas. And for me, I have a lot of fun in the 19th century. So I enjoy doing that. And I enjoy doing, research projects with collaborators at Stellenbosh, as I am at the moment, at University of Zimbabwe, which I did last year with, partners in Senegal and in Nigeria. I think that that's really great. And I love getting into depth in that way. But I think it's also really important that this kind of research gets communicated more widely so that we don't just keep ending up telling the public more generally, we don't just keep ending up telling these same stories over and over again while the research is really progressing in these exciting different directions.
Thank you for that. So I guess looking to the future, how do you hope your book will influence readers' specific understanding of Africa and its economies?
Yeah, I think I'm hoping that it sort of helps people understand that, it's been a mantra for a while now, but, that Africa is not a country, right? That there are lots of different economies across the continent. And the idea that a country like Nigeria is going to have the same kind of concerns for its economy that a country like Chad is going to have, that isn't really, that there is no one size fits all kind of approach, but also that there is this like deep history of intervention and that, the idea of Africa as a universally or continent in need of, economic rescue by the West is not, that's not actually historically true. And it is not necessarily, true even today, that there is this vast diversity of experiences and these vastly different ways of approaching the economies of these different countries. And, that it is an exciting and varied continent that people don't have to approach with this sense of pity.
So from the research and the work you're doing, I know this is a very open and general question, but what do you think the future of African economic thought and policy looks like looking ahead, whether it's in the next 5 years?
Ooh, yeah, I'm not very good on the future. I think if we're thinking about these cycles of these patterns that I talk about in the book, I think there is there's a moment now of, I think, in the humanitarian space of shifting towards a like local perspective. And I think, that the multipolarity of the moment has definitely given some African governments like more agency in thinking about who they are approaching for economic partnerships, and for funding for projects and those kinds of things. So I think that all, and then there's, a huge tech sector boom there. I think there's a lot of hope that the sort of capital that comes through the huge remittances boom, the sort of, the kinds of, that kind of remittance infusion is actually, doing way more than any other kinds of foreign investment at the moment for entrepreneurial takeoff on the continent. All of these sort of factors could be hopeful. And I think that it is a moment in terms of African continental economic thought to be paying a lot of attention to how the West is talking about the dangers of Chinese intervention, the dangers of Russian intervention, the dangers of losing the kinds of power that it has had, right? So for sure, it is worth always being on guard about whoever the foreign intervention is coming from. But I think also that the situation in the 1870s and 80s would come to mind as being relevant here in terms of that cyclical structure. That as soon as that power shifts or that agency shifts to African leaders to choose, or to, African business people to choose who they want to do business with. The pattern in the 1870s and 80s was, that as Britain perceived a sort of shift to, oh no, they're doing business with the Germans, they're doing business with the Americans. That was the moment when the scramble happened, right? Because they wanted to shut down those avenues of agency, right? They wanted to sort of monopolize the trade. And so I would say that, like, I am very hopeful that, those things that I mentioned will lead to, a sort of economic boom. I would just say, be wary of attempts to sort of re-monopolize that power.
Quote of the week.
As people, we often have quotes, mantras, proverbs, affirmations that keep us going when times are challenging or when times are good. Do you have one that you can share with us today?
I like to remind myself to stay curious.
Yes.
Yeah. I think there's a tendency amongst academics or experts more generally to think that we always have the answers. And I think it's more about, having the questions rather than the answers. Staying curious.
Fantastic. What a perfect way to end today's conversation. Bronwen, thank you for joining us and sharing your in-depth knowledge, I guess, into some of the complexities of history of Western economic intervention in Africa. And I've enjoyed reading the book. I've not finished it yet, but I'm close to the end.
Good.
But it's definitely helped me kind of challenge some of those entrenched, whether you call them narratives or notions, and also consider some of the unique economic traditions and knowledge systems that have been on the continent for history or years, decades, centuries. So yeah, thank you for that. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast, and we will definitely keep in touch.
Thank you so much. This was really fun. Speak soon.
Thank you to everyone who has listened and stayed tuned to the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or tell a friend about it. You can also rate, review us in Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast. Thank you, and see you next week for the Unlocking Africa podcast.